Hey everybody, thanks for tuning into this video. This is going to be a bit of a different video. I apologize, I know it's going to be longer. I probably won't do as much editing just because of the sheer length of this video, but a lot of you have asked me this question over and over again, and I haven't given you a good enough answer in these videos. So in this video, I'm going to attempt to answer this question. And the question is, why did I go from being a very stubborn atheist who was very strident and frankly very argumentative to being somebody who now believes that Jesus is divine? It's a good question. It's very legitimate. I have some really good answers to this question, and I want to get into some of those answers in this video because I just feel like it's justified that you ask the question, and maybe this is the thing that you have the biggest right to be curious about, and I really do want to explain myself. All right, first, a lot of prefaces, unfortunately. Number one, I apologize for the length of the video. I will try to make my delivery on each point very snappy so that my speech is concise and terse and still gets the point across. All right, number two, this should really be maybe a two-part video series because, my journey was divided sort of in between, do I believe in God first, and then do I believe in Jesus? In this video, I'm just going to talk about the reasons why I came to believe that Jesus is likely divine. And the other preface is that this is really like a three-part series. So in other words, there are three different sort of categories of reasons why I decided that Jesus is likely divine. In this video, I'm going to talk about the philosophical and sort of maybe literary reasons why I decided that Jesus likely represents divine truth. There are sort of two other categories. One category is the historical evidence, why the narrative of Jesus seems convincing. And the third category is the scientific evidence, why I was specifically drawn to the theology of the New Testament that Jesus presents. But in this video, I'm going to talk mostly about historical and philosophical and literary reasons. If you want to see more of these videos, please let me know. All right, the next preface is that these aren't necessarily the best reasons. I just thought these would be good reasons that I could fairly tersely explain in the format of a short-form YouTube video. The real journey of my coming to believe that Jesus was likely divine is something that I've written about over the course of 4 books. So I will probably try to put the most relevant book in the comment in the discussion section of this video, the description, just so that you all can read more about this if you're interested. All right, now first, before I get into my reasons for believing, I just want to quickly do a plug for the channel. Number one, we're a new channel. If you like this video, that really does help us out tremendously, much more so because our channel is so new. I would love it if you subscribe to this channel. Please click the bell icon for notifications so that you don't miss out on future videos. And the most important thing to me is just put your comments in the comments section because this is really intended to be more of a discussion, and I hope that you all will help me keep that discussion moving in the comment section. Almost everyone that I've had this conversation with has come away with, I would say, a more nuanced or a more highly engaged perception of what Jesus means to some people. So I hope that you all come away with that perception as well. All right, first of all, I want to talk about this quick bonus section. These are not the reasons why I started to believe that Jesus is divine or represents divine truth. So these are the reasons that people commonly assume that this is the most, in other words, common assumptions that get made when I tell people that I believe in Jesus. So number one is fear of death. Why do I think that I'm not just clinging to religion because I'm afraid of death or because I have existential angst? Well, a few years ago, I was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and I was actually quite content with the understanding that as an atheist, that's what I was at the time, I was very content with the knowledge that, I would die and that would be the end of it. Now, I'm not saying I wasn't afraid of death, but I very much could identify that I was very afraid of the moments leading up to death. Like I didn't want a painful death, and I just wanted to be very comfortable, and that was my biggest concern. But I was totally comfortable with, I'm dead, that's it, I turn to dust, and that's the end of it. There's no post-death existence of my consciousness. So I really don't have a lot of fear of death. I don't feel like I have any religious angst or existential fears. Second reason, this is not due to any religious upbringing. I was brought up in a very austere religious environment that was not Christian. I then became sort of anti-religious. And again, I was a very strident, argumentative atheist. I was very stubborn. And I was also a very content atheist. So I had no inclination to come back to religion. All right, the next reason, it wasn't because of any social pressures. None of my friends know me as an atheist. My family is not aware of any of this stuff. So this is all stuff there's no social pressures on me to leave atheism and to embrace Jesus. So I've made some new friends since I've been going to a church which is nearby me, but I wouldn't say that there's any social pressure. No one's pressuring me to change my mind. All right, and the final reason that people kind of assume is, I wasn't I wasn't, on drugs. I wasn't desperate for God. God never spoke to me. I didn't have that sort of transformative or transcendental experience that a lot of people have. I don't know why that is. I think it's just because I just wasn't. I'm a very analytical, logical, pensive, over intellectualizing person. I don't tend to have a lot of transcendental emotional experiences, anyways. Maybe that's the reason why. All right, and now we'll get into the reasons why. So these are kind of more positive reasons why I decided to believe that Jesus represents divine truth. The first reason is because Jesus was from a very humble origin, but had a very cohesive moral philosophy that was all together, like sort of so cohesively baked together that it's just very impressive. And it just seemed very almost eerie to me that Jesus had such an advanced set of ideas. And on the other hand, Jesus was from such a simple, humble background from everything that we know and everything we know about Jesus from the historical literature. All right, so almost every historical scholar admits that Jesus was probably the most influential person in history, if not at least one of the most influential people in history. Now, despite this, he wasn't a king. He didn't have a legacy. He didn't have any army behind him. He left no inheritance. It doesn't seem like he came from an especially wealthy or well-to-do family. So the fact that somebody so humble from sort of a fairly mundane background made such an impact is alone something that was impressive to me. And it's something that I was like, well, I should learn more about this person. I should dive into him more thoroughly. The fact that he had such a cohesive and advanced moral philosophy from such a humble origin is also alone by itself very, very impressive. If you read quotes about Jesus from Leo Tolstoy, Gandhi, and many other thinkers, many other philosophers throughout history, there is sort of an acknowledgement that what Jesus had is a very impressive philosophy. We'll get into that philosophy in the next point, so I don't want to spoil that too much. But it's almost eerie that somebody so humble would be so admired and would become such a philosophical genius, almost so much so that there are very few people in history who have risen to that level. Especially with the fact that from everything we know about Jesus, he probably wasn't particularly educated. He didn't turn to the Roman intellectual circles, which did exist at the time. He had his own moral philosophy that was very iconoclastic, that he didn't seem, there's no proto ethos of Jesus that we find elsewhere in the ancient literature. So that to me was very interesting and almost eerie. Another thing that's sort of eerie about Jesus is the degree to which his teachings were very, very prescient of what would happen with later Christianity. And, I can tell you more about this because, I went through medical school, and a lot of what you do in medical school is you learn sort of parables and mnemonic devices so that you can remember information. So there's different devices that you can use to remember things. And when you're memorizing different, the facial nerves are, there's a mnemonic device that's like a little narrative story. And each word in that story is the different nerve parts of your facial nerve. And I'm not going to go into that too much because it's probably not that interesting to anyone. But it is just very eerie to me that as I was reading the New Testament, it was obviously and immediately apparent to me that Jesus doesn't care about the people he's talking to learning the lessons that he has to teach. What he cares about is, are they going to remember those lessons for a long time? Now, that's really very interesting to me because if you talk to people, we don't talk to each other that way. If I have a conversation with someone, I'm just trying to convince that person in that conversation. So if my teaching gets to them, that's usually sort of the end of the thinking process for me. It was to me almost eerie that Jesus had the prescience to say, I'm talking to people who aren't going to be able to write down this information for a long time, so I'd better make it very memorable. And that's why Jesus speaks in, parables. I've read the formative texts of the Sikh religion and of the Baha'i faith very extensively. I was very interested in those religions. And to me, it's just, I can't really quote a lot of those teachings. I can tell you about them and I can kind of describe them. But to me, the degree to which I can quote New Testament teachings is so much more articulate. And the reason for that is because they're so mnemonic. And that was to me just kind of almost eerie. If you read the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus actually uses a technique called alliteration where he, every word starts with the same consonant to make it more memorable. I just find that very, very interesting, and it's very prescient, and you don't find that in a lot of other religion origin stories. All right, and again, I'm not going to get too much into the history, but I do want to emphasize under this point that even early Christianity is very impressive and defies expectations in a lot of ways. First of all, it was dramatically energized by the loss of its figurehead. If you look at any modern cult or any religion throughout history, almost every time the primary leader of that cult or that movement dies, almost every time there's a period of recontextualization, right? So the next leader who comes up will sort of reinterpret and recontextualize those teachings. And, often those teachings will be slightly modified. But even like Peter, Paul, and all the other early church leaders were tremendously just deferential to Jesus. They always deferred to Jesus. There was no interest in exalting themselves, and there was definitely no interest in sort of expropriating the teachings of Jesus and reinterpreting them so that they would exist in a new way or under a new context. I find that really, really very, very interesting. And it really defies expectations. If you look at, we'll talk about Marxism and communism later, but it just defies expectations that happened with Christianity. And Christianity does continue to move throughout the world in a very iconoclastic way. And I'll just give you one example, because this is not going to be super emphasizing all the history of Christianity. But Christianity is by far the most ethnically diverse religion. I've talked about that in other videos, so I won't go through all the statistics here in this video. But Christianity has, on every inhabited continent, Christianity has a strong indigenous base. That to me is in and of itself really fascinating. You can go to Africa and find Christians. You can go to Asia and find Christians. So every continent, there is an indigenous Christian movement. I find that really, or what I should say is a Christian movement among indigenous people. That's very iconoclastic. That doesn't exist in a lot of other religions. Now, let's look at counterexamples for Jesus. So we can look at other people who were very influential throughout history. One counterexample that people often bring up is the Prophet Muhammad, who, but if you look at Muhammad, it's very different. He eventually commanded an army. He was practicing for about 6 decades. And after his death, his school of thought was really recontextualized, reinterpreted, and the caliphates several times over, who then took over the Muslim faith, really reevaluated that faith in a lot of different ways and recontextualized it and redefined it. I'll just give you just one example. In 650, Caliph Uthman took all the copies of the Quran at the time and destroyed all the other copies other than his own. So there was a purging and saying like, okay, now my document is now the formative document. That doesn't really happen in Christianity. Let's look at the counterexample of Marxism. I think that's another interesting counterexample to bring up. So Marxism, like Karl Marx, was a really great writer. I really like a lot of things that he wrote, and he gets kind of labeled in a certain way in the North American political discourse. But Karl Marx had a lot of really valuable statements. But he got a lot of his philosophy from Hegel. And then in turn, Marxism got reinterpreted as Leninism, and then that got reinterpreted again as Stalinism. So you see this period of sort of iterative recontextualization with each primary leader when you look at Marxism and its evolution into communism. That doesn't really happen with Christianity. I know there's different sects and there's different people who have, interpreted Christianity very differently, but there is always a degree of deferentialness to Jesus that I just don't feel like that exists in other intellectual movements. Moreover, almost every other intellectual movement in history is based on some preceding intellectual movement, and then a revolution happens when it's reinterpreted. You don't see that with Jesus. In other words, there's not like an intellectual lineage or heritage that Jesus got, that Jesus then recreated. He really creates a system of ideas, a system of philosophies, a system of theologies that is very monolithic. It's kind of like created together, and he presents it in a very unified and holistic way all at once. That's very advanced, and it just seems very surprising that Jesus would do that. All right, the next reason that I have is I actually like the philosophies and theologies of Jesus. Now, this is not wish fulfillment, so I do want to preempt that argument, but we'll get into a thought experiment that I'll discuss later in this reason. But just assume for now at this point in the discussion, until I make this argument in a different way later in this contention, assume for a moment that the most beautiful truths are the truths that are most likely to be true from a religious perspective. So, all right. So with that, let's get into why I like the morality of Jesus and why I like the theology of Jesus. So I've written a lot about this. Probably the most relevant book where I read a lot about this is Radical Jesus. Maybe I'll put a link in the discussion section. But the 3 ideas that I really like of Jesus, which I think are very nuanced and very interesting and very advanced, are humility, love, and forgiveness. Now, the other really interesting thing about the New Testament is most New Testament scholars agree that humility, love, and forgiveness are the 3 values and core teachings of Jesus that do come up again and again in a very iterative way. But what's really interesting about these 3 teachings is that they're each sort of analogized and exemplified by the different 3 components of the Trinity. So if you look at Jesus the Son, that's sort of an embodiment of humility, and Jesus is likened to very humble animals. A lot of people describe Jesus as humble. By the way, that in and of itself is very, very iconoclastic. I have not found any other religion in the world where the deity is described in such a humble way. So Jesus, humility, that kind of goes together. And the second teaching is love. The teaching of love seems to be analogized and exemplified by the Holy Ghost in a lot of different ways. And then there's the teaching of forgiveness. Forgiveness seems to be exemplified and analogized by God the Father, or what I like to call the parent God in my books. So the parent God sort of analogizes forgiveness. And then here's another really interesting thing about the New Testament. So we've talked about the three core lessons and the three entities of the Trinity that analogize and exemplify those core lessons. And also you can actually construct a different moral triangle that kind of goes along with these, which is, to me, very interesting. There's sort of self interactions. So how do you regard yourself? Self-other interactions. So how do you interact with other people? And then self-God interactions. So the fact that Jesus' theology accounts for, 3 points of three different three different triangles, is very, very interesting. So the self interactions are sort of the story of humility, and there's a lot of lessons from Jesus himself. The self-other interactions are the way Jesus interacts with his following, which he kind of hands off to the Holy Ghost. That's sort of analogous of love. And then there's the self-God interactions, and that's all about forgiveness. That's about the Father or the parent God. And so you have three triangles that really align in a really beautiful way in the theology of Jesus. I just think that's really amazing and very insightful and very and it makes sense so well. I've written about this in Radical Jesus, and I get into some wacky sort of geometric explanations for this. Like I talk about the Platonic solids because a tetrahedron is made of three different triangles, and that's the very simplest Platonic solid. And then I talk about the philosophies of Pythagoras. So I go in some sort of wacky directions, but a terse distillation, I think, of this argument still gets the point across. All right, now, again, there's not like a proto-gospel that Jesus borrows this stuff from. There's not a set of teachings that Jesus learned these ideas from. I got super into ancient Egyptian teachings because I was kind of reading them voraciously, because I was trying to come up with did Jesus borrow these ideas from other people and then bring them to Judea? And I really don't think he did. I can't really find anything similar. All right, now here's why this matters and why this is not wish fulfillment. The reason is because if you're evaluating religious truths, the most beautiful truths or the most impressive truths ought to be the ones that are most likely to be valid, right? No, just to sort of argue this to a greater degree, let's consider a thought experiment. Let's imagine that there's a God, that there's a bunch of religions, and religion B is less beautiful than religion A, and religion C is less beautiful than religion B. And let's say you follow religion A, and then you die, and you get evaluated by God after you're dead. And you're saying, well, here's everything that I learned. Here's how beautiful it is. There's not really a retort to that after you're dead. In other words, God's not going to come back and say, yeah, that would have been really cool if that had been the case, but it's not. And, we're going to go with this less beautiful, less interesting, less intellectually fulfilling way of perceiving the universe. I just don't think that's unless God is a very anthropomorphic being, that just seems very unlikely. So if you kind of consider what I consider, which is a very broad conceptualization of God and maybe the consciousness within the universe and the consciousness beyond the universe, I think it's likely that the most beautiful truths are the truths that are the most likely to be true, most likely to be valid. Now, again, let's look at some counterexamples of different moral philosophies, because I think it's worth contrasting Jesus with other trends in moral philosophy just to underscore the beauty of Jesus. All right, so my favorite book as a kid growing up was this 1785 book by Immanuel Kant, Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. It's a really great work. It's where Immanuel Kant comes up with the categorical imperative. I read several of Kant's books several times, and I thought they were really very, very interesting. But if you kind of think about it, this work is a little bit incomplete because it's sort of one-dimensional. In other words, it's really just how you sort of react to a moral action. The categorical imperative, for those who don't know, is essentially a more philosophically grounded recapitulation of the golden rule. So to me, the golden rule is important. It's foundational for morality, but it's really sort of one-dimensional. In other words, it really only determines how we should interact with others. So those other components of self-interactions, humility, and the other components of the theology of Jesus are not really in the categorical imperative in that kind of advanced way. Another thing that I sort of learned as I grew up is, the golden rule is again very important, very interesting, very foundational to morality. But if you look at bonobos, which is essentially a type of a different species of chimpanzee, bonobos have an understanding of morality as well, and they also have an understanding of the golden rule. So to me, I was like, great, Immanuel Kant, one of the greatest thinkers in history, came up with this morality, but in coming up with this morality, he proved that it takes a lot of thought, and you're still at essentially the level of a bonobo. So that to me is very interesting. All right, let's look at another counterexample. This is going to be controversial, but another counterexample is the Ten Commandments. So to me, the Ten Commandments are good moral rules, okay? But they're sort of incomplete because they don't explain what happens when you fall short of achieving those values. So I think one of the nice things about Jesus is he's like, these are the 10 commandments. These are the degree to which you can optimize the 10 commandments. In other words, this is like a star that you're shooting for if you follow the 10 commandments. And I think Jesus goes into that really in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus, which is maybe, by the way, the most important single lecture on morality in history. But, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, the 10 commandments aren't something that you do or don't do. They're something that you can sort of pursue for all your life, and you'll never really hit that moral apogee. So what I like about Jesus is he takes the 10 commandments, he contextualizes them as an apogee of human moral achievement, and he also at the same time says, this is what happens is if you fall short, then there's a pathway for forgiveness. And that's the doctrine of forgiveness and the theology of forgiveness that Jesus teaches. So I think that's, the 10 commandments make a counterexample for the validity of Jesus' teachings. One last counterexample is Buddhism. I think Buddhism is a great moral meditational practice. Traditional Buddhism actually holds that the Buddha was not himself divine. So, there's in other words, I have a lot of respect for Buddhism as a meditational practice. I think it's a good way to move past and mitigate your own understanding of your own wants. But, Buddhism is not as complete a moral philosophy. It's a pathway to move towards enlightenment, but it's not a way of interrelating with the God of the universe. It's also not really a way of interrelating with others. In other words, in Buddhism, it's important to forgive others, and Buddhism does emphasize forgiving in a very beautiful way. But you're really only supposed to forgive others insofar as it moves you closer to enlightenment. So the Buddha gives the pursuit of enlightenment as the justification for why you should forgive others. I think it's really interesting that Jesus is depicting a very, very different view of forgiveness. In Jesus' view, forgiveness is really much more fascinating and much more nuanced, and I think more beautiful for a few different reasons. In some ways, when somebody does something bad to me, what I usually say is, don't worry about it, no big deal. Somebody recently did something that was pretty bad to me, and that was my acceptance of their apology. I was like, hey, don't worry about it, water under the bridge, it's no big deal. Jesus is definitely not saying that. Jesus is saying, your sins are a big deal. Those sins form the millstone of the weight that crushed me down when I was on the cross. So it is a big deal that you sin, but I can take that because I believe in you. And to me, that's a very different statement. When's the last time you forgave somebody and you said, I'm not forgiving you because this is not a big deal. I'm forgiving you because I believe in you, because I know that you can do better. That to me is a much more profound, more satisfying, and more beautiful way of forgiving somebody. And in some ways, the forgiveness that Jesus offers through God is even a quantum level above that, because that's essentially what Jesus is saying is God forgives you. God knows every single particle of your being. He knows you down to the quantum level, to the subatomic level, in the molecular level. Like, God knows every particle of your being. And knowing you better than anyone in the universe could ever possibly know you, better than, and infinitely better than you could even know yourself. God is saying, I know you this well, and I believe that you are worthy of forgiveness. That to me is a really beautiful thought. I just want to close this reason with one other thing that I didn't include, which is just, I do want to underscore the beauty of the Jesus teachings of love, humility, and forgiveness in a different way, in that they all sort of potentiate each other and they all counterbalance each other. Again, I'm sorry that this video is getting so long, but I think that's an important realization. I do write about that in Radical Jesus. And let me just give you one example of that. So humility is emphasized in a lot of religions. A lot of religions are like, God is awesome and you should humble yourself before God. But Jesus offers a very different, much more nuanced perspective on humility. He says you should be humble like a child, and you shouldn't be so humble, so self-effacing, so self-denigrating that you reach a point that you dislike yourself. I think this is one way that a lot of other religions miss the mark. Jesus' humility is not like keeping humble, and just pursue humility, endlessly. Jesus is saying your humility should be counterbalanced by love. In other words, you should be humble, but you should realize that God still loves you. To me, the biggest revelation about Christianity was the idea that there's this sort of real delicate counterbalancing that you can do. You have to be humble to admit that you're so bad that God had to die to forgive your sins. And then on the other hand, you admit that you're so important to God that God actually chose to forgive your sins because, that was a choice to endure that suffering. So to me, that is a really, really fascinating, just sort of counterbalancing act. All right, reason number 3. As an atheist, everything that I didn't like about the Old Testament, all the reasons why I didn't believe in the Old Testament, became very persuasive through the lens of Jesus. So in other words, using Jesus as a lens to view the Old Testament suddenly validated and reinforced the Old Testament in ways that I found to be very, very surprising and, again, almost eerie. So in some ways, you can use Jesus as a hermeneutical key to sort of unlock the meanings of the Old Testament. I'll talk about what that means with like 3 different examples. All right, first of all, the story of Jonah never appealed to me. It's a weird story. It seems half-baked. He gets swallowed by a fish for 3 days. What does that mean? I don't believe that, especially as an atheist, I don't believe that could actually happen. I know some of the language that I'm using is irreverent. I won't get into it in this video, but I agree with like Justin Martyr, Clementine, and Origen, and many other original church founders who all agreed that you don't have to take the Old Testament literally. So I believe I don't sort of take the Old Testament literally, and I think that's fine for Christianity. I've talked about this in other videos, so I won't go too deeply into it. But my point is that the story of Jonah is a really half-baked story. First of all, there's a storm. He goes into a deep sleep on a boat. He's running away from God, by the way. And he runs away from God by taking a boat on the ocean. That's probably not a great way to run from God. But then he gets eaten by a fish. He gets swallowed for 3 days. In the book, it actually says he goes down to Sheol, which is the Jewish afterlife. So I was like, wow, it's almost as though there's a resurrection there. That was, I was like, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. And then he gets vomited onto dry land. And then when he goes to Nineveh, finally, much against his better judgment, and much against what his preference would have been, he would have been happy to just keep running away. But when he goes to Nineveh, he doesn't even see the king. He just sort of says to the city, walking through the streets, "You're going to be destroyed in 40 days." So that to me is kind of interesting. He like sort of does like a really half-baked, half-hearted accomplishment of God's task. And despite that, the king all of a sudden decides to transform and change his ways. And then Jonah kind of grumbles away and leaves, almost as though he's dissatisfied that the king repented. And then that's the end of the story of Jonah. It's a really weird story. And where it is in the Bible is also really bizarre, by the way. The books before and after Jonah are all prophecies. The book of Jonah is more of a parable. It really just doesn't fit into place. It kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. So to me, the story of Jonah doesn't make any sense. And then I reevaluated Jonah through the lens of Jesus. And all of a sudden, everything started making sense. Like Jonah goes down in the belly of the boat and falls into a deep sleep during a storm. Jesus did exactly the same thing. The sea became very tumultuous and very tempestuous. And both Jonah and Jesus both calm the storm. Jonah calms the storm by being passive, by submitting to the ocean, and jumps into the ocean, and then that calms the storm. Jesus calms the storm by being authoritative and commanding, saying, "Storm, you must cease." So, and this description of Jonah being sort of the passive and Jesus being the more active messenger will resonate in a few different ways. And then both essentially disappear and go down to the realm of death for 3 days. Jonah and Jesus both do that. And then here's the really interesting thing. Jonah goes to Nineveh and says, "You're going to be destroyed in 40 days." That really mirrors what the Talmud says about Jesus. That there's a passage in the Talmud saying Jesus is gonna be killed in 40 days because we're gonna kill Jesus for being blasphemous. I won't go into that too much, but this 40-day period is really interesting. And then I think Jesus comes back after he comes back for 40 days, for a duration of 40 days as well. So this period of 40 days shows up in a lot of different ways. So that's interesting. And then the other really interesting thing, the most fascinating thing about the story of Jonah is, to me, that the king of Nineveh becomes sort of the prodigal son. This is not, there's a lot of stories in the Old Testament about the Israelites falling short, and then they repent, and then they see the errors of their ways, and then they become, more righteous after that period. That happens a lot in the Old Testament. But there are very, very few stories in the Old Testament. The only one that really comes to mind for me is that there are other stories. I know if I dig into it, there are other stories. But the only one that really comes to mind of a character who's really, truly penitent, who embraces God, who's part of another ethnicity outside of the Israelites, is the king of Nineveh. So that to me is, in and of itself, very, very interesting, because essentially the king of Nineveh becomes the Old Testament emblem of the prodigal son. And you don't really understand the prodigal son. And to me, even learning the prodigal son story, it was very esoteric and very abstruse. But it's interesting that the only prodigal son figure in the Old Testament is the king of Nineveh. That's the only person who repents. And then what happens to Jonah? He kind of grumbles away, and that's the end of Jonah's story. So it's almost as though the king of Nineveh becomes the hero of the story. The king of Nineveh is the one who's doing the righteous thing with very little prodding. He says, "I'm going to start believing in God faithfully." And then that results in the redemption of Nineveh. Now, Nineveh is depicted in Jewish folklore as a really, really terrible city. It was very sinful. So if anything, you could argue that they really should have gotten their comeuppance. And anywhere else in the Old Testament, when there's an evil tribe like this, that evil tribe gets, smacked down, or there's a lot of wrathfulness that they incur from God. So this doesn't happen to the king of Nineveh. And that to me is really fascinating. And that really only makes sense if you consider the king of Nineveh sort of a proto story of the prodigal son. And then Jonah is sort of the brother of the prodigal son who kind of grumbles when the prodigal son is welcomed back. So that to me is very interesting. There's a lot of interesting metaphors that I won't go into in this video around the story of Jonah. Like, for instance, the word Jonah means dove. Doves are passive messengers in the Old Testament. So they're sort of passive harbingers of change. Jesus was much more of an active messenger. So that to me is a very interesting dichotomy. Jonah also, Jonah goes into the sea for 3 days. Jesus goes into the earth for 3 days. And Jonah calls God the God of the ocean and the God of the dry land. And that's very interesting to me because that is the only time in the Old Testament that description gets used. To me, this was all very, very eerie stuff. And all of a sudden, using Jesus as a lens for the book of Jonah, the story of Jonah made perfect sense. Let me give you more quickly than that, 2 other examples. All right. So one is the plague of death, right? The angel of death is the 10th plague that afflicts the Egyptians and takes all the lives of the Egyptian firstborns, sparing the Jews, passing over the Israelites. That's where the Passover comes from. The Passover lamb is later a metaphor for Jesus. But I think there's something even more interesting here, which is that, the angel of death basically skips over the Jewish household because they paint lamb's blood on their doorpost. Now, that doesn't make any sense to me. If you're the angel of death, you should know what somebody's ethnicity is. You shouldn't, be like, well, let me check your doorpost to see what your ethnicity is. It's like day one of your job should be like figuring out multiple forms of biometric identification. And I'll talk about this in another video, I promise. But anyways, so to me, that weird statement that the Jews had to paint their doorpost with lamb's blood to escape the penalty of death was really fascinating. Now, if you read this story in isolation in Exodus, it's this, the story of the Jews escaping from Israel. It's maybe historically interesting, but it doesn't really have any relevance in our life, unless you read it through the lens of Jesus, right? So what does Jesus say? In fact, he describes this in very explicit terms. He says, the bondage of slavery it's not just a literal slavery. The bondage of slavery is sin. Our sins become our bondage of slavery. What is the penalty of slavery? That penalty is death. The death of the firstborns is a cutting off of your line. So that is a very serious penalty, and that becomes metaphorical for death. And that's what Jesus says the penalty for sin is. Now, how do you avoid that penalty? It's only by accepting the blood of the lamb, by identifying yourself with the lamb, the sacrifice. Jesus becomes very explicitly in the New Testament the Passover lamb. So, to me, I was like, wow, the slavery is the bondage of sin. The angel of death, the 10th plague, is the penalty of sin, that penalty of death. And the escape from that penalty is Jesus, the blood of the lamb, the blood of the sacrifice. So I was like, wow, this now all makes very perfect sense. So it's almost as though the Passover ritual that happens in the Old Testament is really pointing directly at Jesus. And that to me is really, really fascinating. All right, final example, which I promise is going to be quicker, is the story of the staff of Nehushtan. I'm probably mispronouncing that. But this is another story that, again, doesn't make any sense. The Jews, after they're liberated, are in the desert for 40 years. Generations are passing. The Jews are iteratively and recursively falling back into their old habits of sin. They become very sinful. And God is constantly, punishing the Jews for their backsliding ways. And this happens over and over and over again, like every few pages. And then the staff of Nehushtan, what does God do? He sends venomous snakes. The Jews start dying because of this plague from these venomous snakes. So Moses prays to God and says, give me a way of delivering the Jews, right? And what does God tell Moses to do? He says, make a staff, put a bronze snake on the staff, and then anyone who looks at that staff is going to be instantly cured. Now, why would God do this to Moses? First of all, he's essentially telling Moses, you have to create an idol here. That to me seems very bizarre, right? Number 2 is, if God wanted to magically cure the Israelites, he could have just done it. He doesn't need a staff or a bronze thing. And this whole story kind of, again, sticks out like a sore thumb in the context in which you find it in the Old Testament. And to me, this doesn't really make sense until you look at it through the lens of Jesus. And Jesus, again, in the book of Matthew, explicitly calls himself the staff of Nehushtan, saying, just as, Moses put the snake on the staff in the desert to cure the Jews, the Son of Man must be, I'm sorry, I'm paraphrasing this poorly, but the Son of Man must be lifted up in order to heal people from their sins. So to me, it's like the whole story of the staff of Nehushtan doesn't make any sense in the Old Testament. And then you look at it through the lens of Jesus, and he's very specifically, explicitly saying, I am the hermeneutical key that unlocks the actual meaning of this story. And then it all makes such perfect sense. So again, just these examples really show that the Old Testament at least doesn't make sense or doesn't make as much sense without Jesus. Now, does this prove that Jesus is divine? No, it obviously doesn't. It's not a smoking gun. None of these reasons I'm giving you are definitive proofs. But to me, I wonder to myself, maybe the New Testament writers were just such good writers, they were such good writers of fiction, that they knew that they were cleaning up things in the Old Testament by the narrative that they were giving. But that just seems so unlikely for a lot of different reasons. First of all, most of them were Jews, so they would have treated the Old Testament as revered stories. They shouldn't have seen these things as flawed. Second of all, they were not that literarily adept as writers. I'm a academician, but I'm also a writer, so I've also written some novels. To me, the way the New Testament ties together all the untidy threads of the Old Testament is really just fascinating, and it's really brilliant literature. And the two books are too far apart that this could have been something that was pre-planned. So that to me is just really interesting. You take the Old Testament and you look at it through the lens of the New Testament, and all of a sudden it becomes so much of a better, more insightful, more layered, more thematically dense, more esoteric read when you do that. So to me, this was, again, maybe it's not definitive proof, but it was certainly extremely eerie to me. And as an atheist, when I was reading these stories, I found this very, very unsettling. All right, reason number 4. The New Testament is a really insightful, wonderful, very beautiful work of literature. Again, I have sort of a unique appreciation for this as an author. I've written books, including novels and nonfiction books, and I've written, medical textbooks. I've written a diverse set of writings, and I consider the New Testament to be a very beautiful work of literature. Now, I'm not alone in this assessment, and many very secular, atheistic, even very antagonistic writers about literary criticism have acknowledged that the New Testament is a really beautiful work of literature. So, I'm going to quote Eric Auerbach, and I'll refer you to him. He was a Jewish and I think somewhat atheistic literary critic. So he was partially Jewish and partially, I think, agnostic or atheistic. And he underscores that the New Testament was a radical departure from the Old Testament, and it's a radical departure from almost every other book that had existed before it. He calls it a radical new mode of storytelling that's humble, realistic, morally charged, and deeply psychological. So a lot of people have a wide and deep appreciation for the New Testament as a work of literature. Now, we'll talk about later in this reason why this contributes to the truth, but bear with me while I go over some other things about the New Testament that I think make it a really, just independently of anything that you believe theologically, a really beautiful book. All right, here's a few examples. There's fourth wall breaks in the New Testament. This is a very, very advanced technique. It doesn't show up for the first time in the New Testament, but it's very advanced. Jesus asks, "Who do you say that I am?" This is something that he's not just asking to his disciples. He's asking the readers. He's essentially asking us this question. Jesus interacts with doubting Thomas, saying, "Blessed are those who don't see and yet still believe." I mean, that's like, you can almost see Jesus in your mind's eye when he says these things, turning to the camera and kind of pointing at us and saying this. And there's even a point at which the disciples are criticizing Jesus' use extensively of parables. And he's almost talking to the reader here, and he says, there are those who will hear about this parable that I'm telling you, but they will hear it, but they won't understand it. They'll see it, but they won't see it. They'll be blind, even though they'll be deaf, even though they're listening. And this is another really interesting meta fourth wall break. I think Jesus' employment of the Socratic method is very advanced and very insightful. We live in an era of podcasts and YouTubers and people who are trying to be social media influencers. And if you notice, the very successful ones are the ones that have the most engagement, the most conversations with their audience. So they often ask questions. So this is insightful and prescient use of a very interesting literary technique. Jesus asks over 300 questions, depending on who you ask. Different people have counted it between 300 and about 340. He answers less than 10 of those questions. So it's a very Socratic method. There's also extended metaphors in the New Testament. Now, these are layered metaphors where there are several things happening at the same time with several different meanings depicted in the same set of events. So I've talked about one of the extended metaphors in the New Testament, which is the lessons of the New Testament become exemplified by the Son and the Holy Spirit and the parent or the God, Father, image, the Father God. There's other extended metaphors, like if you read the Gospel of Luke, what's happening is Jesus is taking his disciples on a journey, and as he's taking them on the literal journey that they're going on, he's also taking them on a spiritual and philosophical journey. So as they travel, they encounter different lessons, and Jesus lays out the parables that interpret those lessons. And this use of extended metaphors is really beautiful, very layered. The stories that Jesus used we've talked about them being resonantly mnemonic, but they're also very deeply human. These are very I think it's really wonderful that Jesus goes through the parable of the prodigal son, but he does it in 3 different ways. He does it with the sheep first, and then he ends with the son. So he's essentially laying out a pathway of making it more and more relevant and more understandable to his disciples and also to us, the readers. There's a lot of interesting layered in philosophy and analysis woven into those parables. If you read Charles Spurgeon, C.S. Lewis, Tim Keller, there are a lot of people who have written about the words of Jesus. So the fact that Jesus can plant seeds so deeply in us that become such engaging topics of conversation generations, thousands of years later, is really, really fascinating to me. That alone is a very impressive achievement. And then, there's also very interesting character arcs in the New Testament. Peter starts off as being very fearful. He becomes then a very brave proclaimer after the death of Jesus. Jesus himself is rejected. He becomes the stone that the builder refuses, and then he becomes the cornerstone. That's an incredible arc. Saul of Tarsus is depicted as a really evil, wicked, very acerbic prosecutor of the new Christians. But then later on, he becomes Jesus' strongest apostle. And to me, not reading the New Testament and not really realizing the whole arc of Saul was really fascinating to me. When I read about Saul in Acts and how he kills people and how he's a really very bitter prosecutor, and then he transitions, that was really shocking to me. There's a lot of things in the New Testament that I think are really fascinating, very, very human, very, very three-dimensional character arcs. Now, my question to you is just to ask yourself for a moment: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, could they have just written this because they were just good writers? I mean, Mark uses kind of very crude, very grammatically rough language in his gospel. So most people agree that Mark is not an especially adept writer. Matthew, Luke, and John has a lot of Christology, so maybe we should put that in a different category for now. But, if you look at Matthew and Luke, they weren't writers. It's not like these people went on and had literary careers. It's not like they had literary careers before this. Luke was just, it seems pretty clear that his intention, at least, as he states it, is to just, write down things as they're happening around him. So to me, it just, maybe these people just kind of lucked out and stumbled into a work of literature that was really brilliant and really very far ahead of its time. But it just doesn't seem very likely. All right, let's just look quickly at one counterexample, and that's the donation of Constantine. This was a really great forgery that was, written in the 8th century AD or the 8th century CE, depending on what terminology you like to use. But so this is a really interesting document. It was proven to be a forgery after a few centuries, but it was used to grant the Pope a lot of authority. So this is an example, and this is essentially the first example of where people were writing something that was false, that was a hoax, but they were writing it for a specific religious motivation. So that's 800 years after the New Testament was written. So to me, it's really fascinating that if the New Testament is a hoax, if it is Luke saying, hey, I'm trying to tell you the truth here, and he's really just lying about everything, that makes it a stunningly successful hoax. The donation of Constantine was 800 years later, and it was debunked after a few centuries, and it was, I think, debunked in around the 15th century. But to me, the New Testament has not yet been debunked. I just think that's very, very interesting. So I just find it very interesting. And, this does not prove that Jesus is divine, obviously. In other words, I'm just saying the New Testament is a really brilliant work of literature, almost eerily so. It just, I think, points you in a different direction about considering Jesus' divinity. To me, this argument is at least compelling enough that it puts another breadcrumb in your journey where you're sort of moving towards Jesus. So for me, it moved the needle a little bit. This may not seem like definitive proof to you, but to me, just the literary beauty of the New Testament was, in and of itself, a very compelling thing that sort of led me further on my journey. All right, now the last reason number 5. Jesus was very, very deeply radical and revolutionary in a way that challenges my preconceptions about what a human could actually come up with if they were left alone just to their own devices and their own philosophies. So in a world that was very ethnocentrically divided, Jesus came out with a philosophy that was deeply anti-ethnocentric. In other words, Jesus was like, the Jews are no longer going to be the chosen people. There's, the Good Samaritan is, one of the most widely known stories in the Bible, and it's not even about somebody who's Jewish. Jesus is extolling the virtues of a lot of people who are not Jewish, who are of different ethnicities. Jesus is very sympathetic of other ethnicities. He reaches out to other cultures. This in and of itself is very radical, especially for first century Judea. There just really wasn't a precedent for a non-ethnocentric belief. Now, if you look at powerful leaders throughout history, they almost always have a very potent appeal to ethnocentrism. So Jesus remains radical even to this day in the degree to which he was not appealing to any one ethnic group. He was really purposefully, intentionally cutting across ethnic lines. There's a radical egalitarianism in Jesus' philosophies, right? Each and every person is equally loved. I think this was really exemplified by the interpretations of Jesus that Gottfried Leibniz had. I love Leibniz. He was the person who invented calculus. And he was he was very Christian motivated, and he was one of the main opponents of slavery during the Enlightenment movement, and he was motivated largely because of the radical egalitarianism of Jesus' theology. Right? There's also a radical power inversion. So Jesus creates, and explicitly says that the meek will inherit the earth. Everything that Jesus says is, he who is last will later be first. Everything that Jesus is saying is the hierarchies that humans create are immaterial, and he kind of inverts and subverts those expectations. He also creates a community that transcends family, right? There are many instances in the New Testament of people having to disagree with their families, people having to sever family bonds, or family bonds failing. So Jesus creates a community that really transcends family in a very interesting way, particularly for first century Judea. I think that's really interesting. And this is actually a harbinger of one of the most important moral conquests that's ever happened in history, which is the early Christian repudiation of exposure practices. So it was common throughout Rome to expose your infant. And I hope this is not offensive to anyone, but if your infant was born with any disabilities, any obvious issues, and if they were, or even if just that they were female, I hope that's not offensive to people, but it was common to let your infant then die from exposure. So you would literally just leave your infant outside and let it cry itself to death. It was a tremendously cruel practice. It was the Christians who first resisted this practice, and they actually created these foundling wheels. It's very interesting history. I won't go all the way into it. But in other words, this was actually the first wide-scale utilization of an adoption practice. So we kind of take it for granted now that there are safe spaces where people can drop off their children if there are unwanted children or unwanted infants. But this was really the first example of a cultural, communal ethos that pointed the finger at family dynamics and said community can be something that is important when families fail. I think that's really radical. And there's a lot of other examples of why Jesus was very radical. That his power inversion, the fact that Jesus' glory comes from painful death, the fact that Jesus' victory comes from loss. He suffers an ignominious death, and that becomes his exaltation. That's really fascinating. Moral esotericism, very layered morality, becomes a very symbolic simplicity. In other words, the cross is a very simple sign of the messages of Jesus. And so you can distill the very esoteric, abstruse messages down to something very simple. And here's the really incredible thing is that Jesus becomes a metaphor for his own radical beliefs. In other words, Jesus subverts expectations in two different ways. Number one, he's a God who incarnates as a human. It's kind of debatable who you talk to, if there are other religions that have done this since the time of Jesus. Probably the most notable example is the Baha'i faith. But really, this is a huge subversion of expectations, particularly for that era. The fact that Jesus, as a God, became incarnated as a human is really, really very, very radical. Jesus' life subverts the expectations. Jesus' own life subverts the expectations that he lays out for people, just like his teachings are teachings of subversion of expectations. So in several different ways, Jesus, in his death, subverts expectations by the fact that there's no comeuppance for his killers or his detractors. There's no rewards, essentially, for Jesus' disciples. This is very radically different than a fictional book that somebody would write. I've written a lot of, having written fiction myself, I've written a few novels. There's, the fact that there's no justice in the New Testament for Jesus' disciples or his detractors is, to me, very interesting and very radical. And then Jesus is never once described as glorious, beautiful, or awe-striking. And this became the seed of the criticisms of Jesus, that, people were making fun of the Christians for worshiping a God who was so human, humble, and mortal. That's maybe the greatest subversion of expectations. So to me, it's not only interesting and eerie that Jesus was so radical, it's not just that he was such a revolutionary in a way that stretches what I can conceive of humans being. It's also that in several ways, the radicalness of Jesus, the revolutionary way that Jesus lived and the revolutionary way that he died and then was exalted after his death, that all creates a very homogeneous package that is, kind of wraps up a lot of very complex beliefs into a very neat little package that, although it's neat, tidy, small, and monolithic, is also at the same time very radical, revolutionary, and iconoclastic. So again, to me, the story of Jesus is really radical. It's possible that Jesus was not divine, and maybe I'm just reading into the evidence too much. And I think a lot of people will come away from this video maybe not being religious necessarily, but I hope that you realize that to me, it was very impressive that Jesus could be such a radical revolutionary. I don't think I can name anyone in history who's been radical as much as Jesus and in the same way. And then at the same time, their life and death in ways that they couldn't even control became very thematically resonant manifestations of their own lessons which they taught. That to me is just so eerie and uncanny that, I got to know these stories as an atheist, and I just found them to be very, very disturbing to my atheism. And it finally led me to sort of believe that there are actually good arguments out there that Jesus was likely divine. Okay, so I know at this point that this video has gotten way too long, and I apologize for having such a long video. I just, again, this is a distillation of 4 different books. But I really want to know your opinion. If you've made it to the end of this video, I really want to know, did this video move the needle for you? In other words, is there anybody out there who saw this video who then said, maybe I don't believe in Jesus now, but I have now a more nuanced or deeper appreciation for why some people are drawn closer to Jesus? Moreover, I also want to know, if you're a Christian, does this change what you think of Jesus? One of the interesting things that I've come across in my conversation with Christians is I say, why do you like Jesus? And they'll say, well, he's my God, he died for me, all. But I'm like, but what is it that you like about Jesus? So, in other words, if I just told you about this guy named Jesus and he was a teacher, what would you like about his teachings? And a lot of Christians really struggle with answering that question. I find that really interesting. I don't think God wants us to be slavishly devoted. I think that's the lesson of the New Testament. He doesn't want us to be servants anymore. He wants us to be friends. That, I think, is the whole transition of the New Testament that Jesus says in John 15:15, one of my favorite quotes from Jesus. So I think that's the real message here is if you're Christian, does this video change what you think? Do you now think wow, I now have a renewed respect for Jesus as a teacher because I've gotten into these ideas? That's what I really want to know. So, all right, anyways, I'm going to stop the video there. I know this was a super long video. I'm so grateful if you made it to the end of this video. I do want to say that I appreciate the support. If you like this video, especially because it took a lot out of me, I would really love that. If you subscribe to the channel, that would be really great as well. Please click the bell icon for notifications. And I would really love it if you tell me what you think of these arguments in the comments section. Don't listen to this video all in one sitting. Maybe break it up into different sittings. I essentially did this in one sitting, one recording, but I think you could definitely break it up. I will probably try to take parts of this video and dole them out in individual shorter videos, just because I know this is a lot to take in. But anyways, I'm super grateful. Thank you all so very much for tuning into this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed my perspective, and I'd love to know what you think. As always, thanks so much for listening, and have a really, really wonderful day.